there's one reason where I think gear does end up mattering. Honestly, I do get a little bit flustered when someone comes up to me and asks me about my gear. Not because I don't want to share it or don't want to help them out, but mostly because I don't even know how to answer that question or why that question is important. In my head, I'm thinking, how much do they know about photography? Would they have heard of the gear that I actually have? And if they haven't, should I tell them about the specs of my camera? And it gets a little bit worse when people tell me about their gear, when they say that they have something camera or they bought a new something else lens. I can't even bother to remember any of those names for this video. Honestly, it's like when they say those things, I'm expected to automatically get this burst of information just from that one model name. And maybe for professionals that's easier to do, but I think for most photographers it's not really anything that is important enough. There've probably been new releases from Sony and Canon by the time I'm even done making this video. But there are moments when I really do love talking about gear. And it's when you can tell me how that gear has impacted your photography. And I don't mean how much sharper your images are now or how much blur now you can introduce with your wider aperture that you didn't have before. I think of photography partially like solving a problem. And when you're trying to optimize for something, in this case, our improvement or progress in photography, there's a really neat way to make the biggest impact, which is to focus on the low-hanging fruit that have the biggest impact. And those tend to be the ones which are your biggest weaknesses, and then work your way up from there. For us amateur landscape photographers, especially when we're starting out, there's a lot of things that will help improve our photography much more so than buying new gear. And that could include things like understanding the aesthetics of composition, figuring out how light moves and how light works, and honing your editing skills to go from a very oversaturated mess to much more simple, much more well thought of edits. When I am trying to improve my photography, I'm trying to think of the thing that will create the biggest marginal increase in my photography. When I started out, that was actually just going out to take more photos. I was so used to not going out at random times or early in the day that when I started going out more often, I saw a drastic improvement in my photography just because I was leveraging the right light at the right time. I was trying to look for opportunities, then wait for opportunities to come to me. Don't get me wrong, gear does help with all of this, but it needs to be solving a problem that you know will drastically improve your photography. And that can only be determined once you've reflected on your photos and reflected on your weaknesses and see what is actually holding you back from creating more beautiful images. And usually it's very rare that you're going to become bottlenecked by the gear first. And when it does come time to thinking about gear, really understand why is it that you want new gear and what is it that the new gear will help solve. If, for example, you're trying to take photos of landscapes and you've gotten to a point where you're really good, but adding a little bit of stability will create the biggest impact in your photography, then tripod might be the right way to go rather than a new lens or a new camera, for example. Let's say you want to buy a wide-angle lens. Have you found yourself being unable to work with perspective distortion and wide-angle lens? Have you tried taking more photos with your phone which have wider-angle lens and trying to compose images using that? How does that work for you? What limitations do you see there? Are you comfortable enough with the composition? So basically trying to figure out all these other things with a wider angle lens, and then maybe once you've reached the limit of you having your phone, for example, as your wide angle lens, then you're at that point where having a gear will really jumpstart the next level of your photography. Did you start printing your photos and really start to enjoy printing them really large? And that's when you'll also start to consider the number of megapixels in your camera. And then you'll realize, okay, maybe this camera body doesn't have enough megapixels and I do want to print a lot more bigger photos. And then it might be time to buy a newer camera. Sure, you could also compensate for this by actually creating panoramic images and using a zoom lens. But at that point, you do have a specific problem that you're trying to solve, and upgrading your gear might be a reasonable way to do it by then. But until you know what specific problem you're trying to solve with buying new gear, I really don't think it makes any sense to focus on the gear. Because in the end, it isn't the precise gear that matters, it's the gear which really opens up the bottleneck in your creativity. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye.